Okay. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the first of this year's live sessions for Express Media's Toolkits season. I would like to first acknowledge that I'm dialing in from Wongal country this evening and pay my respects to any First Peoples who might be in the audience. This is stolen land, sovereignty was never ceded. I'd also like to extend that respect to the traditional custodians of the land that I'm dialing in from, and acknowledge that before here, I was living and working on Wurundjeri country for the better part of 6 years. And so I feel very connected to those two countries, especially. I encourage you all to share in the chat where you're located right now. And wanted to ask Elias, where are you dialing in from?
I said, thank you very much. I'm dialing in from unceded Gumbaynggirr country up on the mid-north coast of New South Wales. It's a pleasure to be here, and I want to acknowledge my incalculable debt to the First Nations of this particular country. I was born here, I grew up here, and yeah, I owe more than I can say to this place. So yeah, very grateful to have a chance to acknowledge that.
Thanks so much, Elias. So we're here today to talk a little bit about creative writing, specifically nonfiction. But I'd first like to talk about Toolkits and give a little introduction to what Toolkits is. So Toolkits Connect is a 12-week program for writers aged 30 and under to develop their skills in a unique and exciting online environment. Toolkits is run by Express Media. Express has been around for over 30 years now, developing, supporting, and promoting young writers through workshops that develop skills through opportunities for constructive feedback and publication, such as VoiceWorks, and through awards and programs that recognize excellence. Toolkits Connect is generously supported by Copyright, Cultural Fund, and Australian Poetry. Today's session will be available on YouTube as a resource and will be captioned in the coming days. So we're here with Elias. We're going to be chatting to Elias Grieg, who is a writer and educator. His writing has appeared in Overland, The Guardian, and the Sydney Review of Books. And his bookseller's memoir, I can't remember the title, but the cover is blue, was published with Allen and Unwin in 2018 and is available in all good bookshops and some bad ones. He rents on Gumbaynggirr country. I think I actually pronounced that incorrectly, even though I did double check before the chat. So sincerely sorry for that. Okay, great. And just a quick intro about me, as I have to do in these kinds of sessions. I'm this year's Toolkits nonfiction facilitator and have been living in so-called Australia since 2016, publishing since 2019, and teaching since 2021. I write nonfiction, poetry, and a little bit of literary criticism. If you'd like to ask any questions tonight, you can do so on Twitter using the hashtag EMToolkits or via the live chat section on YouTube. Feel free to ask any relevant questions as we go along. I'll also make sure to have a chunk of time towards the end just to open things up for a Q&A as that allocated period of time. So, Elias, I thought maybe a good way to open up the session would be to ask you to tell us about your pathway into creative writing.
Sure. Thanks, Hasib. I just want to acknowledge as well how excellent your jumper is. I'm seriously jealous of this.
Thank you so much.
Seriously
I wrote
jealous
a
of
poem
this
about
very
it last year.
Yeah,
Yes,
so good.
thank you.
So good. Excellent knit.
Thanks.
My intro into creative writing is largely as a reader. And reading is a wonderful way to get into anything because reading is very cheap. So reading is something you can do on very little money as long as you've got a tiny bit of time, if you've got a library card. And I guess that's worth stressing because I think creative writing is also something we often do when we don't have a huge amount of resources. So I started reading and I read and I read and I read, and it's like watching people dance. Even if you're very, very reluctant and very, very clumsy, as I was to begin with, you still want to try a few steps when you're watching everybody else do it. So I started because I had this wild notion that I might one day be able to write things that I would be proud to read. And I think I'm still chasing that, but I think a lot of what I do is really just a homage to the pleasure of reading, just the kind of sheer luxury of it, but also what it reveals, what it what it allows you to do in your life. So I think that's the kind of the thing that started me off. I also did a lot of academic training, which kind of helped with the creative writing, but I think that
mm,
the creative writing urge, no matter what I did, was there underneath a lot of my critical work, and came
yeah,
before some of that study.
yeah.
So yeah, that's kind of it's one of the ways in, I guess.
It's interesting actually that I feel like, I mean, so you always kind of had this inclination to want to write as you were reading, to kind of be a part of that, I suppose.
It just sort of grew, in exactly the
Mm.
way that, I don't know if you've been at a big family wedding and everybody's dancing and you're like, man, I kind of need to dance.
Yeah,
I
yeah,
kind of
yeah,
need to
yeah.
dance, even if it's with, even if it's with my auntie or whatever. I have to get up there. I've got
Mm.
to. It felt strange not to try and join in the conversation in that sense.
Yeah,
But
yeah, yeah.
it's I get I'm reluctant to sort of enchant these things too much because the discourse around
Mm.
writers gets so kind of overly perfumed and kind of
I know what you
precious,
mean.
because writing is also like something you bash out with very little time and something you can do on the
Mm,
back of an envelope when you're stuck in traffic
mm,
or whatever. But you start, whether you like it or not, to have phrases in your head. You start to look at things and
mm,
describe internally how you might transmit that to someone. And I think that
mm,
started for me really, really early on as a kid. You start to practice with phrases in a funny way.
mm, mm,
I
mm.
forget which author calls it mouth writing, but you'll walk along and you'll be like, cool cloud. How would I say
Yeah. Yeah,
that?
yeah, yeah. I
How would I
do I do
say that?
understand that. I
Was that
wonder as well,
similar for
something I've
you?
was it similar for me? Yes, although I feel like I read a lot when I was younger, but I never actually conceptualized it as something that I could, and I wrote quite a bit as well, but I never conceptualized it as something that I could share publicly, until I was in my last year of high school, and I was always more in terms of my creative output, it was visual art, and then in my last year of high school, one of my teachers, my English teachers, said to me after an assignment as a part of our coursework where we had to like write a missing chapter from one of the novels that we were reading, close reading.
Mm.
Um, she was like, "Oh, you can write quite well. Like, have you ever considered pursuing it?" And until that was floated to me as an option, I hadn't really considered it myself. And then from that point, that was when I started, wondering what it would look like for me to pursue it. And then I ended up, when I went to university, taking some creative writing subjects just to test it out and realized that I loved it. Um, but I did want to go back to something you said about, I mean, mouth writing, or that idea of having the writer's lens in the way that you see the world. Because I've spoken about this with a few friends and even seen writers who have tried to articulate it in pieces, that it ends up kind of infiltrating the brain in a way that we no longer can feel like pure observation anymore without this tickle in the back of our minds to capitalize or narrativize it, maybe is a better word, in some way. And I wanted to ask whether you felt that, especially with nonfiction. I feel like maybe that it happens more with nonfiction than it does fiction.
Mm. Yeah. Yeah. So, yeah, I love this question for a lot of reasons, partly
Mm,
because one
mm.
of the things I did was complete a PhD in Romanticism, and the Romantic poets are deeply hung up on
There
this
you
idea
go.
that the more you write something, the less alive it is. And like, man, did I
Mm,
just kill my ability to ever be in the moment again?
mm,
John Keats, when he's on tour in the Lake District in 18 whatever, has this great
mm,
line where he says, "The imagination exceeded is at rest." So when
mm,
stuff is so beautiful, when you're so involved in a
mm,
moment, you dream of this total moment of lack of self-consciousness. You're completely in that
mm,
that moment. I think for me, having grown up where I did and having the ludicrous privilege of access to the landscapes I have, it only becomes a problem when you haven't been to those places for a long time.
mm,
So when I
mm,
write, the touch tone I'm measuring myself against isn't necessarily everything that's come before, though that informs everything I do. It's
mm,
you need to have a look at how other people have tackled a particular theme or a particular aspect, because you're missing out if you don't. But a lot of the time, all you're trying to do is catch up to the sensation or the feeling that you had once upon a time, or
mm,
even very recently. And I think what fascinates me about nonfiction in particular is the way in which your your standard for truth is very demanding. in a curious way,
Mm.
because you are actually flying your flag under the banner of nonfiction. It's not all made up, which means you have an object or a kind of material thing that you're doing justice to, even if it's your own history. It's something I think a lot about when I write personal essays in particular, is making sure that I'm taking myself as my own object as well as my own subject.
Mm.
Like I need to look at myself as a historical thing as well as a, you know, a
Mm.
person who has particular feelings and particular kind of political leanings. So it's interesting in a way, because the more I write, the more, how do I want to end that? The more I write, often the more intense my experiences are starting to become, because I'm
Mm.
aware of writing as only a pointing device. You know, I can sort of point at
Mm.
something, I can make something visible. But when you go and look at that thing again, you're reminded of how wonderfully and openly and kind of, I don't know, enablingly inadequate writing is. Great thing about writing is it's not
Mm.
done. Every piece I've ever written is on the way. You know, it's on the way
Mm.
somewhere. If it got there, then I would probably have to stop writing, you know, because
Yeah.
there'd be
Yeah.
nothing to
Yeah.
say, or because I would have become so smug in my own practice that I'd be like one of those old Australian novelists who just writes the same novel over and over again because he reckons he's got
Mm-hmm.
the world in a kind of, in a little jar.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
yeah, so it's, yeah, yeah.
Well, that's great. I mean, interestingly, what you said about that act of pointing, I remember having this I had reconciled, it was back in 2020, maybe late 2019. I'd read an essay collection. My friends and I had read the same one, and it had received fantastic criticism. People loved it. It was becoming a bit of a cult classic, and I didn't like it, and neither did they. And for both of us, we realized that what we didn't like was the fact that this author was just pointing at things, and it
Mm,
was very much a book, like an essay collection, dense with social commentary. Um,
mm,
but I became really frustrated at the idea of, like, I don't know, the way that I had articulated it was that it was like a suitcase, and the author hadn't even had the decency to open it up and interrogate what was inside. They were just pointing at it, being like, "Look at that suitcase." And I wonder as well, like with nonfiction, how you get around that. I suppose it's the writer needs to acknowledge that they only know so much, and they actually can't do that interrogative work through language because there are restrictions. But also, you don't want your literature or your writing to fall short, because otherwise your readers end up being frustrated at this unopened suitcase. So I suppose what's the middle ground when you try to interrogate and you have something to say, some kind of outlook on the matter.
I think that the limitations often give it mobility. And if it
Mm.
doesn't, in the sense that when a picture is incomplete, you're inviting someone to complete it. But you also, you do your absolute best to convey everything you
Mm.
know about a subject when you write. And so
Mm.
in that sense, I'm often rediscovering what I know in the act of writing it. And so it sort of
Mm.
leaps up uncannily in the moment of writing. You might suddenly flash out on a new relationship or a new interconnection to that experience, to something else. So
Mm.
it is, the suitcase is great, because what writing should allow you to do is unpack the suitcase rather than just go,
Mhm.
suitcase.
Yes.
It
Yeah.
should tell you it's blurred in time. I get frustrated. So Terry Eagleton has this great line about poets who believe that language should cleave as closely to the object they're pointing to as possible. And
Mm.
he said, you know, poets would cease to be poets; they'd become greengrocers. So you'd just be like, an apple, a pear.
Yeah.
How
Yeah.
about that? The end.
Yeah.
But of course, what you're doing in that moment is you're not just looking at an apple and a pear. You're wondering, you're seeing those apples and pears throughout time, throughout your experience, throughout the entire sort of literary history of apples and pears. And you might,
Mm.
if you're really lucky, try and make some kind of point with that. You know, are you thinking about the provenance of your organic fruit? Are you thinking about
Mm.
what the person who touched that fruit was paid in the shop you bought it? Are you thinking about who you'll give this fruit to, who needs fruit, who has fruit, who can get it, etc., etc.? So
Mm.
the suitcase is great because writing invites you to unpack it. You know, it
Yes.
allows you, its
Yes.
curious sort of temporality means that you're always on the verge of going, okay, so what's in there and where did it
Mm.
come from?
Mm.
Does that
I think
help, or
talking
am I
about
just
it
desperately trying
helps
to
a
dig
lot, and
myself out
actually,
here?
what you said about the apple, I think makes a lot of sense as well, because what I think about poetry that maybe feels a bit jarring or feels disappointing to me is when a writer really puts all of their effort into the language as opposed to the substance. And so I remember, again, a different conversation with a different friend. We were talking about poets who love to frill up, like describe a tree in as many words as they can, as opposed to just calling it a tree and seeing how many times you can use the word tree in a different context, or like give it a different history. And I think maybe you can use that same outlook on nonfiction and on prose, in that you're not just trying to play with language, but also give a single object as many iterations as you can through that interrogation. So no, your answer made a lot of sense. I liked it a lot. Thank you for sharing. I'm conscious of time.
Somewhere in here.
Sorry, keep going.
Please.
No, please.
Somewhere in here is something about refusing that sort of natural sense of alienation, as if imagining that writing is a sort of strange metaphysical fluid that comes strictly out of the like little homunculus in your brain typing away. You know, writing is. I was thinking about this the other day, watching my son puzzle out something using his words. And it's very clear to me that my son is using language at the moment as a kind of limb. You know, he's kind of picking things up in this strange little linguistic hand of his and going, whatever it is. In this case, it was the lawnmower. But, you know, I'm sure I could come up with a more poetic example with more preparation. But he was almost like sending out this little echolocation burst. He was like, if I talk at it, will it talk back? Do I understand it? Do I understand it more fully if I've described it in language? I think as soon as you start experiencing language, you start experiencing, in some sense, that weird latency of looking at yourself looking. And that, for me, watching my son started at about like 8 months old. So it's not a natural to us. We're writing our experience all the time. So I try not to be too hung up about it, but I can't help it. Yeah.
I also think that lawnmowers are particularly poetic. Like, I would love to read any kind of poetry or writing about a lawnmower personally. So, okay. In the interest of time, I thought maybe I would talk about your 3 essays in Overland, and then invite you to share a short reading from it. But you published 3 essays in Overland in the years 2021, 2022, and 2023. And they're all about housing in some kind of way. And I do see that as a through line across them. And when I read them, kind of pieced together, the 3 of them served as a triptych together. So I thought maybe you could summarize each one for me, and also talk about whether or not you did conceptualize it as a triptych, or how it felt to write 3 essays that kind of speak to one another in that way.
Sure. Yeah, so I mean, the first one that came out with Overland was called The Whale Ghosts, and that came out of the very strange experience as living as a very poor student in Australia's richest suburb, which is Mossman, which you might also know as the kind of heartland of Tony Abbott around that time. It's since gone to an independent, but it was, you know, it was kind of the bridge of the Death Star for Australian conservatism. And so it was this weird experience of being a minimum wage worker in this beautiful but just deeply, deeply paranoid and strange place. I compare it in the essay to living like fleas on the nice dog, because there was that strange sense of kind of contingency and terror that somebody was about to know we were here and be like, hey, poor people, you're not allowed here. Why are you looking at these beautiful harbour views? And so I just became more and more fascinated with the kind of psychopathology of the suburb. Like, what's going on? And I read more into the suburb's history, and I discovered that it's a former whaling depot. This sort of horrifying, you know, very, very standard settler colonist called Archibald Mossman moved from slaving in the West Indies to whaling in the Southern Ocean, and so switched from one kind of body trade to another. And so the sort of strange, half acknowledged, half unacknowledged history of Mossman is actually slave wealth to whale wealth to just wealth. So I got more and more interested in what it meant to live in this particular place, and the kind of terror of living around all these extremely powerful, extremely paranoid rich people. And then how much of that was just capital screaming out like the devil at an exorcism? Like, was I just hearing the ghost in these people's money, or was it the whale ghost? You know, was it some kind of bizarre curse laid on the suburb? And so I use that kind of lens to just delve into that strange feeling of unbelonging, or kind of,
Mm,
I mean, the double vision we all live with in Australia, which is this extraordinarily beautiful place with this deeply unacknowledged, fundamentally denied, and furiously repressed history of
mm,
violent extraction, colonization, invasion, and attempted genocide. Um, so that was sort of the first one. The next one is No Shelter, which came a bit later, and it's about my mum losing her housing in the place where I come from, because that place is now extremely valuable for the
mm,
extraction of a very peculiar kind of resource called leisure, and like uh, country escape. So it's about
mm,
my
mm,
mum living in her house, and essentially because of Airbnb, because of the property regimes we all live under, mum's housing becomes too expensive. And I wanted to find out what exactly it was that was driving us to, first of all, pretend
mm,
we lived in the country, which all of us kind of do in our own weird ways. We all dream of these funny little neo-pastoral escapes, and what continuity that had with that kind of settler colonial haunting that continues to go through. And then the final one is Freehold, which came out this year. You can tell that I you can tell that I don't have much money and I have a small child, because my output is very slow. So
mm,
apologies
mm,
to everyone asking for more work. I'm getting to it. I am trying. Freehold was about really where it all began for me, with my
mm,
mother and father building their house on Gumbaynggirr country, where I am right now. Um, why they did it as two kind of working class Sydneysiders, what they imagined, what particular
mm,
form of kind of terra nullius they were projecting in imagining they could just pick up and put a house wherever they wanted it, without thinking about what the land was like, what they were doing there, what the long
mm,
histories that they were treading on perhaps might
mm,
do to them when they moved to this place, and what it was
mm,
like as a kid to kind of spectate on this, not really understand what the forces involved were, and then come back to it as an adult and try and puzzle
mm,
it together. Um, so they are a triptych, a totally accidental one. These are my preoccupations. This is what I'm obsessed with. I'm obsessed with historicizing my own particular place in Australia, at the same time as I'm
mm,
worried about the form of colonial narcissism that might produce.
mm,
So that weird tension between wanting to engage in that kind of self ethnography, but at the same time wanting also to make sure that I always do that in a way that isn't just involved in seeking, further and further recesses in my own particular navel, but actually understanding myself as a historical phenomenon, and pulling in
mm,
everything I can from those histories that live through me and most of us every day. Um, I think
mhm,
that
mhm,
the through line is haunting, because I'm fascinated by long causations and hidden causes and objects that are no longer there that still exert pull on
mhm,
us. So, going back to the first essay, how do Mossman's whales still affect us? How are we still how are we still kind of swimming in the bow wave of their ghosts? What
mm.
you extract something and sublimate it into capital, and can you reverse that process, and so on. So a totally accidental triptych, but clearly expressive of a deep and abiding, slightly nerdy obsession, particularly with whales.
I mean, I suppose it makes sense as well when maybe your approach to nonfiction in that case is that you as the self are a vessel for these broader observations, and so would that being your experience, or would that being something that dominated a lot of your kind of outlook? I don't know, but maybe that's a reductive way to word it. That's how the triptych or the through line naturally
Mm.
formed, because that same lens was what was occupying these three different landscapes or three different subject matters. Um, yeah, I love that. So if you would like to share a reading of Freehold,
Sure.
I
Yeah.
think we'd all love that. Thank you.
Thanks. I see. Yeah. So this freehold is about my mum and dad building their house, and this is where increasingly things start to go wrong. The thing you need to know about that house is that it was never actually finished, and that tells you everything you need to know about the project in general. Um, so here we go. As the house neared completion, my father dreamed more and worked less. A qualified carpenter and builder, he refused most employment, quarreled with contractors, squandered what little money we had on projects that did nothing to improve the house, but rather seemed aimed at deferring its being finished and the reckoning with the land, his life, himself, that would come with such an ending. Missing the ocean, he decided we must have a dam to swim in. Scorning the muddy oblongs of our farming neighbours, he conjured visions of a crystal pool, artfully landscaped with boulders and tree ferns, its banks free from the unholy traffic of hooves, a pure vehicle of leisure untainted by practicality or primary production. Waters sparkling with windfall light. An excavator came. A dam was dug. Water was pumped in and quickly drained away. The bottom was unsound. My father lost interest, returning to his armchair, the television, smoke. I would join him there sometimes, climbing into his lap, taking comfort in his momentary peace, blinking away the cloying scent of dope. Sometimes my father would take me on walks to the west, beyond the boundary of our land. Down a slope across a narrow paddock owned by the farmer, through barbed wire fences and fields of paper daisies, we would reach the skirt of a gently sloping hill, heavily wooded. The trees were different here. Sassafras, coachwood, black wattle, white beech, remnants of the cool rainforests that had covered the region before they were stripped for rare timbers, ring-barked, torched for pasture. Under the canopy, the light was green. Sprays of epiphytes lit up dark trunks like fan lights. Moss fell and hung in ropes and curtains. Tree ferns, the tallest I'd seen, grew in paired lines following the slope, a processional of woolly columns splendid with palmy capitals and curlicued shoots. Orchids bloomed strangely, feeding on the moist air. Turquoise butterflies courted pale flowers. Birdsong was varied, rapturous, constant. My father called it the wilderness and seemed to need it as a place beyond his interventions. When we came here, we spoke of making burrows, tree houses, nests. On our hill, the garden fell increasingly into neglect. The macadamias and fruit trees planted in the cleared land along the steep drive were overwhelmed with bracken and wirevine, pulled down or choked by weeds. The tree fern my father had poached from the bank of the brawling river to the east to mark the path to the front door was dead or dormant. The house's inner walls remained unpainted or unpanelled, showing bare gyprock or rough hardwood frames. The internal stairs had no banister. My brother and I raced up and down on all fours. The front steps were uneven, a rush job, jerry-rigged with stumps and boards that flexed and shifted underfoot. The veranda that stretched the length of the facade and partway around both sides had solid rails but was unfinished. A single line of rope stretched across the gaps. Riding my cheap plastic tricycle one morning, I saw a flash of something just beyond the rails, a rufous fantail flitting between a sapling and the trunk of a tallowood. Pushing closer on bare feet, I stretched out against the safety rope until the front wheel of the trike went over the edge. I remember it perfectly, the sudden lack of resistance as I passed between rail and rope, the ground rising towards me, tufts of grass and lichen-flecked rock, the stunning impact, the after vacancy, the mineral taste of my concussion. How it made me think for a moment that I had eaten the rock. I remember the vividness of the sky when I rolled over, the colours I saw when the pain arrived, the way it made me shout rather than cry. I'd fallen 2 meters and landed face first on a small basalt boulder, almost losing my right eye. My father stretched a second line of rope. How are we doing for time, Hasib? Have I got a bit more time?
I think that's great. And you've also chosen a fantastic excerpt because I have a great question. But we're going to move on to the Q&A, the open Q&A shortly. So while I ask my question and while you answer it, if people want to put some questions into the chat for us to come back to afterwards. But the reason that excerpt is so brilliant is because a few weeks ago, we had a session, a toolkit session with the participants, where we were thinking through and navigating how to write the natural landscape on this continent, being a settler colony, without leaning into certain kind of tropes, I suppose. And so you framing it the way that you have in this essay, I think, feels really intentional, but also not voyeuristic and not I don't know, cumbersome in a way that sometimes when you read natural landscapes in Australia, they can be. And so I wanted to ask whether that was like an active negotiation that you had to do, how you figured out how to write the landscape in a way that felt true and just to the way that you feel is your relationship to the land politically and socially.
It's a great question. It's a terrifying question.
Yes.
The first thing to say is I had fantastic editors at Overland who looked over this one. And I wrote this in a state of just quaking terror. This is extremely risky in a lot of ways because of the way it does inhabit its landscape. And yeah, so luckily I had Jonathan Duncan, Evelyn Araluen on the other end of this being like, yeah, not that bit. I think John only took out one thing where I compared, very unwisely, I compared the Song of a Crimson Rosella to Vivaldi, and he's like, "Oh, trash! Get that out of there. That's colonial trash. Just take that away and sort yourself out about it." She was absolutely right to do. But in terms of how to do this, I'm still a student in this. I'm still learning every day because it's a unique kind of agony of where we are as colonial subjects, and whichever diaspora we belong to, we still have to negotiate how to talk about where we are without taking ownership over it. And I think for me, the only way I can do this is to talk constantly about how all of this possession is undergirded by a totally, I think, illegitimate set of property laws. And so every part of my writing, I want to have that historical current running through it. To see my father imagining himself back into this wilderness he creates over our back boundary is to see the kind of constant need to just recycle this fantasy. Once you've created a colonial environment, you're immediately disgusted and need to find new grounds for colonization. But at a very basic level, it's about making sure that your trees are correct. Do you have the right species of tree? Evelyn Araluen has a terrifying set of poems called the Ghost Gum Suites, where she just makes fun of people for using the wrong gums in the wrong landscape. And I'm terrified of that. Like, getting the facts wrong around my trees is the thing that keeps me up at night. Like, what if I've got the wrong gum in the wrong place? Making sure that your impressions are always your impressions. You're not speaking for the landscape in a particular way. You're grounding it in your own experience. You're showing that this is a thing that I saw. These are my conditional experiences. The land is so far beyond me. This is a thing that is much vaster than even my inkling needs to be in there. I think also you need to make sure that your descriptions, particularly if they're diluted, particularly if they're kind of, they are fantasies, you need to make sure you hedge them in with those conditional phrases, that they seemed, that they, when you take the kind of confidence of metaphor to say one thing is another rather than one thing is like another, you need to watch that, because that, I think for me at least, is the temptation towards a new kind of colonial projection, a new kind of fantasy building. And I think, coming back to the suitcase question, you've got to make sure that as well as everything in the suitcase, you've described the outside of that suitcase extremely well. I think there's a duty to fidelity for settler writers like myself that is constantly flaunted and waved. I remember going to a poetry reading once in Glebe where a friend of mine said that a town I grew up in called Bellingen had a beach. And I almost stormed out of the reading. It's like, this is there is no beach here. Like, how can you put a beach in this landscape where it doesn't exist? I mean, an actual waves beach rather than a tree. Thank goodness that's a degree of accuracy. But I think that's really important. And I think that the history has to constantly be put in. To encounter a landscape in Australia is very rarely, there's no virgin landscape here. There's no unsettled place here. Everything has layers of history. The incredibly shallow ones that we can see as settler colonists, and then the much deeper ones that First Nations people can see. But I think at very least we need to acknowledge, particularly in those natural landscapes, where history touches, because it touches everywhere. When I walk into a forest here, I'm aware now in a way that I've never been of what has been taken out of those forests, of what landscapes are missing. And it's part of that hauntedness. In acknowledging the hauntedness, you're acknowledging the things that were taken out for you to be there, that underwrite your perception in the first place. I think language can make that tension present, but I think we also need to be careful that we don't then gothicize it and turn it into its own pleasure. We've got to make sure that we come back to the fact that this is a terrible loss, maybe. I don't know.
No, that's great. And I think what you said about, I mean, just the way that you frame your own lens and not being too prescriptive, I think is a nice rule of thumb for writers to keep in mind, where it's like, what are you actually imposing onto a landscape when you do use a metaphor rather than a simile, for example, to kind of present that as the how-to, or like this starter pack, if you will. Okay, we've had a couple of questions come in. So we've got, did writing for you require picking a niche focus or a lens that you continue to write from? So for example, writing about a consistent topic from the lens of a specific knowledge or training in an area. What kind of background knowledge did you have? And what did you have to acquire through the process of writing certain pieces?
A lot of Google Maps. Again, when you become a stick in the mud about things, you want to get the street names right. You want to get all that boring stuff right. So often the undergirding of my pieces is a deeply unfantastic attention to triviality, to seeing how a single little sort of fugitive material fact can suddenly sing into this huge notion of history moving through us, or something like that. But in terms of preparation, I mean, all these things happened to me. So one of the really freeing things about, I think what we sort of, it's become a bit of a kind of slur word to call things a personal essay, but I'm very happy to own these as personal essays, partly because of what you can do with the personal. If the thing is personal to you, then it's yours. Most of the research has already been done because you've been there and you've experienced it. It's just placing it in that larger temporal frame to understand what it meant and why it felt significant. I mean, I think that so often we're struck in our everyday lives with particular experiences that seem uncannily sort of redolent of a particular kind of metaphorical value. It's like these things happen constantly. Our lives are shot through with terrifying significance, even when we wish they weren't, even when we're just going to work. So in terms, for me, the niche research I did was being from a relatively poor background and having to do weird contingent things to be a student. And it all just moved from there. And it slowly tended back towards the place where I grew up, and trying to bring the same level of scrutiny and observation that I used on Sydney when I got there, because a lot of my work, funnily enough, involves Sydney and perceptions of Sydney, to use that on where I came from as well. So I think niche or focus comes to you because things happen to you, at least through that personal essay lens. But I think in every other way as well, if you're interested in it, that's kind of half the thing. It's your niche, it's your focus. If it isn't, you might be feeling a degree of pressure to come up with significant writing rather than write things that are significant to you. And I would really recommend dismissing that out of your head. Just that idea that there are certain subjects that are proper and fit for you to consider. Anything can be considered. If it's happened to you, if it's happened to your family, if it's happened to your friends, if it happened to people you're moved by perceiving, as long as your approach to it is honest, it's going to be fascinating. As long as you work really hard to do the topic justice, it's going to be great.
I like that. I do think about it as like writers are nosy and readers are nosy too. So anything that a writer is going to feel like that they want to know more about, a reader is also going to be as invested, because at the end of the day, that's why we consume this kind of media in the first place. I'm going to combine two questions that I think work well together. So we have, I'm always conscious of getting bogged down in a tangle of subordinate clauses. How do you best balance lyricism with clarity? And then another question that says, I was interested in how you both kept talking about poetry. How do you think, do you think there's a tight link between the art of writing poetry and the art of writing creative nonfiction? So maybe that balance, I suppose, of poetics and lyricism within prose, and what that sweet spot is to you.
Yeah, they're both really great questions. On the subclause, I need constant restraint. My sentences get too long because the subclause is the most lovely, ridiculous, luxurious thing. I sink into those things like bards. I'm like, oh, I could have another clause. I could help myself to another little clause there. I like a sentence that just goes and goes forever. I like the sense of paragraph that feels like a kind of really lovely swim, or a really long and fascinating drive, or something like that. I like prose that will continue to go, but the mental breath, like the physical breath, gets exhausted. You need a sentence. So the really sort of practical way of doing it is to make sure that you're always thinking with that breath in mind. And I usually measure my own writing against my comfort in reading it. When you put it into your own words, you have a kind of natural attention to pace and variation, and where you get puffed. And if you get puffed, you probably need a sentence break. So thinking about it that way, but also loving the subclause. I hate this drive towards simple language and short sentences as if, this was the way we talk. There's a particularly nasty myth abroad at the moment that the working classes all speak in short sentences to each other. Like we meet each other at fence lines and go, "Oh, potatoes terribly bad this year, full stop. Very bad indeed, full stop." From my own experience, the natural kind of grammar marker of the working classes is the subclause, because conversations are long and involved and usually involve several kinds of relatives and so on and so on. So love your subclauses. Just read with that breath in mind, that mental breath or that physical breath. It links nicely to poetry, because poetry has to take the breath incredibly seriously because of the way it arranges itself on the page. So I read poetry constantly when I'm writing prose, partly because I don't think there's a kind of quantum gap between the two, but also because poetry works with just an extraordinary discipline and concision. Even epic poetry is still much shorter than big novels. It's what you can do in those short lines, in that short space, and that limit that I find constantly useful and kind of, I don't know, fructifying in my own practice. Like I need to go and read poetry to see how people are pulling off these insane tight turns. Like, how did you get there in that? How can you do that in a sonnet? I would love to be able to do that.
Such limited real estate. Yeah. I do think it's important what you mentioned about maybe differentiating between concision and pacing. Like a long sentence can still have the breaks that you need in order to keep going. I think it's such a fallacy that the only way to depict something clearly is through a concise sentence. You just need to make sure that it's punctuated and articulated, even in the syntax and the language that you're using, in a way that gives readers this like oscillation, I think, of rhythm on like a line level. So I suppose maybe that's something to keep in mind. We actually have just gone over time, unfortunately. It went by so quickly. So I'm going to, maybe actually I'll end with this last question because I quite like it and it's a short answer. Do you have a favorite sentence that you have ever written in terms of language or construction?
Oh my goodness. It's very tricky. It's funny because it's really hard to read your own work back and see it as anything other than a series of like grueling and slightly embarrassing moments of deep thought. It's like, wow, why did it take me that long to talk about walking down the street or whatever it is? I can't remember it off the top of my head, but there's a bit in The Whale Ghosts that I wrote and then came back to and went, who wrote that? Man, I like that. And I love those moments in your own writing where you encounter a sentence you've written and you're like, man, who was that? That was pretty good. It doesn't happen very often. I think that one of my favorite images in that essay is just, I have this throwaway line about cars ticking in their mechanical sleep. And for some reason, I'm just like, oh, cool, that's done. I never need to write about cars again. Cars are put away forever. Because cars do tick in their mechanical sleep. It's their engines cooling. I'm like, yeah, cool, done, finished, out of here.
It's beautiful.
But I love bits. There's like, it's like anything. You like, oh, this bit's good. I like this bit. This was fun to write. This was a pleasure to be a passenger in this particular set of images for a bit. It was a real pleasure to just kind of go with this. So sometimes your favorite sentences are those moments of flow, or when you're just depicting objects that you totally adore, that you just cherish. Just like, this is my favorite thing to talk about in the whole world. I could do it endlessly. Those are the ones, those are the ones you remember. Sometimes they're really long and sometimes they're like the shortest sentence you've written in the piece.
Yeah.
It's a lovely
I think that's what's so rewarding about writing, is maybe the joy that's derived from surprising yourself. Like, oh, I didn't know that I could articulate it that way or see it this way. And you feel so pleased that, that language incited the feeling that you didn't think was articulable. So yeah, that's a great question. Okay, thanks everyone for your questions and for your engagement in the session. And thank you, Elias, for such a generative chat. Elias, do you have a website, a piece coming up, any kind of project that you'd like to plug while I've got you?
So I'm very, very slowly working on a book of
Mm,
essays, which are very tentatively titled, The Whale Ghosts, Sketches from a Haunted Country.
mm.
That's going to be at least a year away because I keep doing this thing where I think that I should have a child. So that's it's a real mistake if you're a writer. You can write around it. It's just tricky. So at the moment, I
Yeah.
have to refer you lamely to my social media, to Twitter and
Mm.
Instagram, which I'm on. Jump on there, put up with my nonsense, and every now and then, maybe once every 6 months, I'll bring out a piece. I've got hopefully one piece coming out with me and Jin soon on what I've been reading, which was supposed to
Okay,
be a
great.
nice, quick little piece of work, but I've tortured it into something totally out of shape. So once I
Mm.
stop stressing over that, that'll come out. But other than that, yeah, you guys will have to wait, sadly. It'll be a little while. But yeah, follow me on social media. Send me an email if you want to talk about any of this stuff. I'd love to hear from you. My email is just my name at gmail.com. Give us a shout. Always happy to chat.
Thanks, Elias. Just a reminder to everyone viewing that the captions will be added in the coming days. And to join us next week on Wednesday, the 12th of June, as Anna K. Blair sits down with the author Melanie Sayward live on Express Media's YouTube. And so all of the Toolkits participants in the chat today, the nonfiction participants, we're going to jump over into the Google Meet for a little bit of a private debrief and an extended Q&A. So I'll see you all there shortly. Thanks so much.